Aperture.
So thank you so much for having me. This is a legendary place. I'm looking at these walls and these big black white photographs. This is not some Instagram bullshit. This is serious stuff. This is photography as physics art, self-art, whatever it is. So when I think about the idea of documentary, and by documentary, I think not only of film and video, like people like Ziggy Vertov, but also, of course, photographers, right? The genre of photo essay, photojournalism, which I think comes to the surface in the 1920s and is as valid today as 100 years ago. I'm sure there are some special cases where a number of people made decisions on how to edit the film, right? Or how to sequence the photographs. Like, to quote Ziggy Vertov again, in the late 60s for a few years, Jean-Paul Godard has worked with Goran, and we kind of had this collaboration, but it was just two people. So, as an example, I always come back to one of the most classical film documentary, or perhaps like a handbook of advertising, propaganda, whatever you want to call it. It's all above. Ziggy Vertov, A Man with a Camera, and this is one of many examples of our visualizations. Where normally visualizations consist of lines and bars and pie charts, but an image is not a point. The image is not data point. The image is an infinite world. So we're trying to create new ways to kind of summarize large visual data sets and to reveal patterns in them, but make visualizations out of original media itself. So in this case, we use automatic software to take A Man with a Camera, 1929, which consists from 1,762 shots, and we automatically kind of broke it into individual shots. And then I just wrote a little piece of software, Silva, kind of making the decisions. And again, people here probably can say, well, there are always examples in history of photo collectives, but if you go look at all the beautiful Magnum books out here, the history of photography is very much narrated as the history of great photographers. So thinking about it, I thought, how can we approach contemporary visual social photography, Instagram, Pinterest, Flickr, and so on? Can we think of it as perhaps some kind of bastard form of non-intentional, collective, aggregate photography? So we try to make some kind of experimental research in this direction. So last summer we published a project called phototrails.net, where we downloaded 2.3 million Instagram photos from 13 global cities. We did it all on a single laptop. It was actually done by my collaborator, who's a PhD student in art history. Yes, there are historians coming up who know how to use computers, so it can get interesting again. And then, we did a very kind of, very approximate, very kind of broad comparison. So we produced, various visualizations where we didn't visualize all 2.3 million images because we wanted to compare kind of patterns across large samples of photographs in these different cities, right? So here, for example, you see some examples. So it's the same technique. I call this a radial image plot, where images are automatically organized by software by some of their visual features. So in this case, you can probably guess that the distance of an image from the center is okay, still loading. Remember this phrase from the 90s, still loading. There was even a book published, this name. Okay, so the images, right, so from the center we organize by average brightness, and then the perimeter we organize by actually average hue. And you can zoom in, I think, once it loads completely. You never know. When you go live, it's always a performance, right? So those of you who use PowerPoint, shame on you. Okay. And basically, the software which we use, which I wrote, we can make images approximately up to 30 or 40,000 pixels, so that's a little bit smaller. And it's obviously a very formal exercise, right? Because if you start looking closely, you have images of food and selfies and everything. But that was our kind of first attempt. Because we can say, millions of people are taking pictures of the city of our city, right? But of course, creating this documentary, you can't just do what Vertex did. I mean, you have to have software to sort and organize these images. And because for the software, it's kind of hard to figure out the content of images. It's much easier to automatically measure basic visual properties like contrast, texture, and color. We kind of just took the simplest route, and we always try to go for low-hanging fruit, right? Why work hard if you can work, if you don't have to do it? Leave it to smart people. So we just organize this photograph by these visual properties, in a kind of, again, very basic attempt to see, organize in this way, how different are the different cities. So here is San Francisco, Tokyo, and Bangkok. And here, of course, comes the most important step, which is interpretation. So what is the right way to interpret it? Like I'm looking at this, and what I see is actually both similarity and difference. Right? You get almost a full color spectrum, but you can see how in Bangkok, certain parts of the spectrum filled in more. In San Francisco, how certain parts of the spectrum are filled in less. So there are different ways to aggregate image collections in this way. So actually my favorite is not this one, but very simple organizations of images by upload date, which we call montage, or what we call sequence. So when we did this, something unexpected happened. Okay? Right, so this is all the images which were uploaded in Tokyo during the course of a few days. Right, so it's about 53,000 images. So we simply organize them by date, right, by upload date and time. And you can see, right, this subtle but clear patterns of day, night. So again, if you think about Vertex, like a day in the life of a Soviet city, here we have a few days in the life of a kind of post-capitalist, post-digital city. And if you zoom in, you actually start seeing certain routines, right? So people go eat ramen, and then we go, play play video games, and we go to office, right, and call them mistresses or whatever. What I find really fascinating about this image, you see how each slice is a little bit different in width, right? So every day and every night is a little bit different. So if somebody is uploading, right, more photographs, maybe it's Friday night, the slice becomes wider. If somehow, maybe this is Monday, people are uploading less photographs, it becomes narrow, but everyone is a little bit different. And I personally totally love it, because here we start seeing some kind of subjective dash collective social time, kind of visualized, simply from quantity of photographs which are uploaded. Right? So even the simple characteristics such as volume of photographs itself can become an interesting pattern. So after we've done this project, we said, okay, so that's nice, but let's go further. And of course, the next step is to look at the particular types of photographs which have particular content. So this is our latest project, which was launched just last Tuesday, called Selfie City. Now I'm very proud to say we started working on it last August, a few months before selfie has become word of the year. So what we've done is, you can kind of read, and try things. There are a few things which I think are very exciting. So first of all, we have a theory section. So members of our team have wrote essays from our history perspective. So this is an essay which talks about selfies and portraits in the history of photography. Here's an essay which talks about social media image in general. And here's wonderful feminist media critique of our project, which actually critiques us. But treated by a friend of mine, so it's friendly critique. I'm not sure. I didn't change anything. So that was one part which was exciting, right? So when you have these findings, which were done kind of for journalists, these kind of sensational things, right? When every journalist calls you, we always ask you the same two questions, like what's the most interesting, what's the most amazing things you found? Okay, so my answer is when we actually looked at, so what we've done is we selected 5 cities, Bangkok, New York, Berlin, Tokyo, and Moscow. And we downloaded all photos from central parts of the cities, which we shared on Instagram during 1 week in December. So it was about 700,000 photos. And then we randomly selected about 20 to 30,000 from each city. And then we put them on Amazon Mechanical Turk. And we asked 3 master workers to tag them. And after a few experiments, it turns out that everybody knows what a selfie is. So we simply ask them, does this photograph show you a single selfie? So when we got results back, and then we can look at the results and the corrected mistakes, it actually turns out, to our surprise, that only 3 to 5%, depending on the city, of Instagram photos are true selfies. And then by true selfie, it's a photograph which you take yourself with your mobile phone, as opposed to somebody takes a picture. And then there are our kind of media type findings, this is percentage of female versus male selfies. So as you can see, Moscow, right, is always girls, who move to the capital, to be the oligarchs, and in New York, like the average age is older because you guys all busy around, right? You go running around trying to make careers, you don't have time for relationships, Okay, so this average smile scores. Anyway, you can look at this. But I think what the most interesting part, right, for us, when we were able to build for the first time a kind of interface which we now can apply to our collections. We can apply it to any photographer kind of history. We can apply it to Magnum photos, where on the web you can interactively yourself navigate through a big database of photographs and then filter these photographs based upon various metadata or automatically features kind of processed by computer, right? So if you go here, this is how it works. Okay. Now again, because of limitations of a kind of web technology, we can't show you 3,200 images all at once. So you still have to scroll, but probably in a couple of years it will change, right? And then this shows the distributions of different characteristics. So the distributions which are in the first column, this is metadata, right? So this is 5 cities, right? So this is, for example, a photograph from Bangkok, okay? And then this is the age. Now the age is a kind of guess. So we ask these 3 mechanical Turk workers, can you guess the age of person in the photo? And then we took the average. Now we also, run these photos through a state-of-the-art face analysis software, which also come out with age guess. So the ages are correlated, but software always judge people conservatively to be a little bit older. So that's interesting little note about machines, right? And then all these other columns, this is the features, like this is right, kind of characteristics of a face, which will automatically derived by software. So we run all the photos through the software, and software returns about 20 different variables. So for example, and now you can basically filter this database in any way you want. Right? So to me, it's a very logical way to navigate with our photo heritage and photo collections. I mean, this it doesn't have to be pose and our eyes open, right? It can be anything else. It can be subject matter. So just to kind of play with it a little bit, we can say, okay, let's take New York, okay? And let's take, females in New York. So now we have 394 left. And now let's say females, who, I don't know, have glasses. Now, there are mistakes, right? Because it's software. Software is never perfect when you do this data mining. And we kind of left mistakes on purpose. But generally, it works relatively well. And then if you like this, let's say you want to share it with somebody, you can say share, right? And you actually get a line which has the parameters, right? So now if I paste this line in the browser, I will get exactly the same graph. So do I have like 30 seconds or 60 seconds? 60, 90? Okay, I'll just show one last thing. So now just to make a circle and kind of go back to the 20th century, so last summer we started to work with MoMA, and eventually we got access to a whole photo collection, which was actually simple. But once we've done the work, now we're waiting for permission to publish it. And I think it's going to be much harder. But I think I'm allowed to show like a single image. And I would love to put MoMA photo collection to this kind of interface. So let me just show you a single visualization, which I think is already opened. Yeah, so here it is. So we've done 60 or 70 different visualizations. So this is about 20,000 photographs. I mean, MoMA told us we gave us everything. I mean, who knows what everything is. And you can also see why museums would be nervous to visualize their collections in this way, because when you look at this, you see how collections are incredibly biased, meaning they're very full in some periods, not full in others, and we can know that, but when you look at data, right, it's a little bit shocking. So in this case, what I did is I simply organized all photographs by year, right, so every column is a year, and you get this kind of like histogram, right, but made from photographs. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out and you'll see what is the history of photography according to MoMA. And this is not plain MoMA, right? MoMA, I think, was the first museum, right, to start collecting photography. But you know, all institutions have their histories, right? And the histories are always the history of winners, right? Think about Dr. Benjamin. So some people just lost. So you have this huge peak, like you have a huge peak in the 30s, and there's like a smaller peak in, in the 70s. Okay? So I think the time is up, but hopefully we'll have time for discussions, and thanks so much for listening.
This is a few months ago. I was in the desert in western Afghanistan, and I was embedded on a special operations outpost, and hanging out with one of my new friends. And we were talking about the evolution of special operations, and the person I was talking to had been in special forces since the first Gulf War. And we were talking about what had happened to what had once been this kind of very marginal tribe within the military. You know, these guys they were the kind of strange, bearded guys who lived out in these tiny little safe houses in the middle of nowhere and didn't have the funding and didn't have all the high-tech toys and who totally lived in the shadow of the guys with airplanes and tanks. And what we were looking at now on this outpost, which was actually a super base. And Iraq and Afghanistan completely transformed special operations. It turned it into not just the tip of the spear, but what in the military they call the main effort. So at this point, these guys had their own airplanes, they had their own everything. They were basically operating a military within a military that was probably the driving force of the operations in Afghanistan. And I was thinking that this is very similar in many ways to the inversion of power that's happened with conventional media and unconventional media, in that those kind of strange, weird pajama bloggers are now the main effort. And I was thinking about this a lot a few years ago, in 2009, when I was taking my first break in a very long time from working in Afghanistan. And this is what Robert Gates had to say about land war in Asia in 2011. But in 2009, he was the Secretary of Defense overseeing the surge in Afghanistan. And this isn't even his quote. This is MacArthur after World War II. So, you know, I find myself asking the same question that has kind of haunted me throughout the time I've worked. Why do we never learn? And what are we doing so ineffectively that we have wars that roll on for decades, or, you know, a decade and change? So that year, while Afghanistan was swinging back from being the forgotten war to becoming the central front in the war on terror again, and journalists were flooding back into Afghanistan, I stepped out and I spent a year hanging out at Stanford with former secretaries of defense and state, and trying to understand what the strategy was, or if there was one. I spent a lot of time reading, and this is one of the documents that actually was the basis of BaseTrack. So this was a leaked report that went from McChrystal to Secretary Gates, and it was the game plan for the surge. And within this game plan, buried pretty deep in terms of pages, but not in terms of importance, was this basic idea that this was an information war. And the thing that caught my eye was this idea that they articulated, that every foot soldier in the coalition military should be trained to articulate a set of talking points, that every single one could be deployed as what they would call a Stratcom messenger. And I thought that was a really good idea, but in a different way. And so that was the origin of BaseTrack. So after that year at Stanford, I went back to Afghanistan, and I brought a small team of photographers. Most of us who had spent many years working for the world's biggest publications, and this time we skipped that. We went straight for the web. And this was our staging base. This was a WordPress-based website that we coded up. And those there are the Stratcom messengers. Every single one of those dots is a Marine or a corpsman, and every single one of them is an entry point to a social network. And so the fundamental question this project was based on was, what is the social graph of a battalion of Marines? 1,000 Marines, how many mothers and wives and brothers and sisters, how many points of human contact is that? And it wasn't, we weren't after Time magazine or Newsweek numbers. We weren't looking for millions. We were looking for thousands. And it basically came down to this question. After a decade, who cares about this 20-year-old Marine who was 8 years old when this war started? But it was very clear. His mother, his father, his brothers, his sister, his wife. And so those were the hearts and minds we went after. And we built the site out in such a way that it was completely designed to target that state of tension and stress and disconnection that those family members were in. So we know that every 2 weeks usually, these guys get a satellite phone call home, and it's actually, this is one of the things they do. What time is it in Afghanistan? What time is it in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina? So we made the site into a dashboard that effectively would keep these family members coming back. That point of, when you wake up in the morning and look out the window and wonder, what is it like where my son is? How long is it going to be till he comes home? So we had a countdown, a ticker that basically ran down the number of days left. And while you were looking at that, you would see how many days this war had been going. So this was the newsroom that we were operating out of. This is in a basement of a compound built by Russians, and off a satellite modem and a couple of laptops and a bunch of iPhones. We were transmitting out across to the other side of the world, to a community surrounding this battalion of Marines in southern Afghanistan. And so these were my tactical communicators. So this is the team that basically ran the site, the embeds, and they were specifically chosen not just for their overt skills, but for their social graphs and who they were. And so a big part of this project was the fact that over the course of months, these family members on a daily basis were learning about what was happening in Afghanistan and that part of the world. And not only were they getting the information that they weren't normally exposed to, they were getting it from people named Habib and Omar and Sadika and Shazday, embeds named Teru and Balaj and Tibidar. At a certain point, we actually had this inside joke that to work on the project, you had to have a name that was completely unpronounceable to a US Marine. And the way it basically worked, it was basically a tricked out blog. But in practice, Corporal Sidoriak here, 2 weeks after I take this picture of him, he trips an IED and is very badly wounded. And what happens then is the Facebook page that we were operating in parallel with this website becomes this kind of rallying point for the families. And it was a point of connection and it was a point of consolation for them. And it also became a point of real disruption and discomfort to many people who were watching it. People who thought that they should not be talking about these things in public. And these kind of evolutions in technology allowed us to do some kind of interesting things too. So at one point a newspaper wrote about what we were doing and published this picture that one of the photographers, Balaj Gardi, took. And the New York Times, very rapidly was contacted by public affairs officers in Bagram who did not like this picture at all and wanted it taken off the web. And the New York Times, to their credit, refused to do that. But we did something very different. We let them do whatever they want. So we told them, we're not going to take the picture down, but if there's anything there that bothers you, we'll actually build you some software so you can black it out with a digital marker. Go for it. And the only catch is like you have to, you get a pop-up window, which would require you to insert a rationalization or a justification. And the fact is, like, what they were asking to do, removing these pictures, is not proper and it's not part of the normal structures, processes of embedded reporting, but that many times embedded reporting doesn't follow those processes. And one of the biggest forms of censorship in embedded reporting is self-censorship. So, this was a kind of a reverse psychology approach to that, in which we said, go for it, do whatever you want. We're not going to do it for you, you do it. And at first, the officer who was doing this thought it was a great idea. After a couple of times, it got so weird and uncomfortable that they basically said, all right, use your best judgment, we'll go back to the conventional embedded rules. And so we did. And the video's frozen, I think, but ultimately, this is what really kind of became the sticking point for some people in the military and people who are watching this, was these kind of private conversations, these conversations that were once private, family members talking about their kids having their legs blown off, and in the words of one Marine officer, questioning the mission and asking if it was worth it. And these are the kind of conversations that they were having. Previously they hadn't been having them in public or on a Facebook page. And ultimately, this is basically what got our embeds terminated. So about 6 weeks before the battalion came home, we were not disembedded, because that's a formal legal process that nobody in the Marine Public Affairs wanted to go into, but we were no longer embedded somehow. And sorry, it's frozen. So, but what happened after our embeds were terminated was that the family members took over the project. And so the last chapter of this project was when the Marines came back, and we weren't allowed anywhere near Camp Lejeune. But these mothers and wives basically picked up where we left off, and they were emailing us photos that our post-production tech would basically tweak on Photoshop, and we'd re-upload them onto Facebook. And ultimately what this was, on some level, the people who disembedded us didn't understand the actual terrain that we were competing for. It wasn't in Afghanistan. It was the human terrain of this social graph online. So, I sometimes ask, or I am asked, is this journalism anymore, or what is this? And I don't know. I don't know how important that term is, or what it's called is. I call it now, the term that I learned from the military, information operations. So this is what BaseTrack looks like now. And it's not because the Pentagon shut down this website, it's because maintaining websites is really a pain in the ass. And we had funding for a 7-month project, which we stretched out to like 2 years, but ultimately we didn't have the time or the money or the resources to keep this thing up and running forever. So we let it go. And when I went back to Afghanistan, I just used off-the-shelf platform called Instagram. And a year earlier, that wasn't an option because we were tied to a satellite modem. It's extremely expensive with very limited bandwidth, but in a very short period of time, Afghanistan had gotten wired to the point that even in southern Afghanistan, in Helmand, in the desert, I could upload to Instagram from an iPhone. And exactly the same kind of thing happened. This picture of a Marine that I posted, it was a matter of hours before his wife found it. And actually that turned this very temporary embed from a few days into an open-ended ticket because the commander of this unit was advised by his wife that there's something cool happening, you should let this photographer stay. So there's another, what I call a social media experiment. Put out a call from Kabul to ask, does anybody want to actually help these people? And within 48 hours, there'd been more money pledged than I knew how to disperse. I actually could not physically move the amount of water that people wanted to buy. We ended up sending food instead, just because we ended up with an impossible logistics challenge in terms of actually piping water. And that led me to probably the weirdest embed I've ever been on in my life, which is where I am now in Menlo Park. I'm actually not in management of any kind whatsoever. And so at some point they invented this term, this title, photo community manager, because bloggers were inventing their own titles for what I was doing. And I really begged not to be called a manager, because I told them, like, if there's any way to alienate photographers, it's to tell them that you're their manager. But, stuck with it. And honestly, it reminds me, they think it's cute when I call it the weirdest embed I've ever been on, but it's very similar. I'm surrounded by 25-year-olds who speak this bizarre, acronym-laden dialect of English. And they live on this kind of enclosed base, and at the end of the day, they get on their convoys of buses and go back to, San Francisco, and sometimes they're attacked by angry hipsters. And there's a lot of talk about freedom and democracy, but mostly a lot of PowerPoint. So, what I do there. So, I heard the term Instagram bullshit earlier, and this is what a lot of people think Instagram is, or this is what people think Facebook or the internet in general is. Cats and selfies and pictures of food and cappuccino. And there is certainly a lot of that, but there are some other, I think, really interesting things happening too. And so what I do now at basically the Pentagon of social media is I support forward operators. So people like Rudy Roy, who are using Instagram as a platform to raise issues of social justice issues. People like Rafiki, who is using his Instagram feed is a family portrait of relatives of detainees at Bagram. So, this is kind of interesting too, this specific thing. Asim is actually operating two Instagram feeds. One is called Pakistan Justice Project. The other one is actually under his name. And he was actually, the Pakistan Justice Project was sort of the primary one. And I was kind of, it was a question like, will we actually even be able to get even minimal engagement for such an uncomfortable subject? And we didn't even notice actually that it was actually his personal, his name, his other feed was actually gaining all the traction. And this is one of the really interesting things, I think, and one of the great things about social media is that individuals have far more traction than institutions. People trust people in a way that they do not trust institutions. This is Patrick Brown, another person I dragged onto Instagram. And this is a project he's been working on for a decade about endangered species and poaching. And this was an actually interesting thread on Facebook, where he announced that he was showing his pictures on Instagram. And one of his friends asks why, really seriously why. And his answer, was pretty direct. It's because he's about to put out a book and maybe 1,000 or 2,000 copies are going to get published. But that's not going to change the world. So, also convenient, somebody offered to introduce him to David Cameron, I guess, how many people can you reach through Instagram? This one, at least almost 500,000 people liked it. How many people saw it? Who knows? This is Peter Turnley, who is almost 60 years old and does not consider himself social media savvy and isn't even on Instagram, but he definitely knows how to work Facebook. He's very adept at it, and within this post, this picture is embedded a very, very smart marketing campaign for a book that he's selling. And he told me actually that his last book, this book, which is I think the fourth one that he published, and it was the first one that he did independently, he made 10 times as much money on as any of the other books before published conventionally. And I think he estimated that 25% of the sales were directly from Facebook friends. It's Michael Christopher Brown. So Michael is, he's a nominee at Magnum, and from what I remember, it's like slightly controversial when he was brought in because he was known as sort of the Instagram kid. And so Michael is basically running Magnum's social media operations on some level, which is really interesting because it means that the most junior member of this agency has the biggest presence on one of the biggest photography platforms. And I think he's doing some pretty amazing stuff there. It's Camille Seaman. This is a ongoing project about climate change. Balaji Road, a decade-long project about water crisis around the world. This one I think is interesting too. So Newsweek isn't actually on Instagram, but they're definitely scouring it, looking for photographs. And here's, a tragic story, but also one that I think about when I hear people talk about social media as being unreliable or not having the ethics or the standards that conventional media did. This is a 17-year-old Syrian kid who was working for Reuters, getting paid $10 a photo when he was killed. And internet fact check, this quote is probably not from Charles Darwin, but it's a good one anyway. And I think this is why I'm interested in doing what I'm doing now, because we are at an evolutionary crossroads right now, where this is a moment where the platforms have changed, the ecosystem has changed, the environment has changed, and it will not necessarily be the smartest or the strongest that survive. It's going to be the most adaptable. And so what I'm doing, what I'm working at, is basically trying to help the smartest and the strongest survive and thrive in this next world. And as Camille says, change is certain. Survival is not. And survival is not a birthright. So this, I think, is what I would ask everyone to think about when you ask, what does Facebook want? Facebook is not a person. Facebook is a platform. And it is what you use it for. So I would say use it. So.
True, what I love about where you end is of course where I begin, trying to figure out, and I will publicly announce I am not on Facebook, and I am not on Instagram, and I'm not tweeting, and everybody tells me I should. It's about time management, and I know it's partly because I can't figure out the right project that makes sense, and that's what I think is so brilliant about BaseTrack, and I've just seeing some of the Instagram feeds. The counterpoint has been seeing endless followers, likes, building massive audiences, and for what? And so what I love about what you featured for us is some of the where it can do. So I'd love you to talk about how could this technology do more for us and help us see the path to use it more effectively. Because I think that's part of these labs, this kind of trying to initiate, stimulate a conversation, not just get stuck as Pied Pipers having long trails of people following us nowhere.
Right, and I think you raise a really important point, which is one that I think a lot about too, where we have this, or there is this kind of inordinate preoccupation with numbers and with the crudest of metrics. So you hear a lot, or there's a lot of focus paid to how many likes something has, how many followers something has, how big something has. And on a certain level, I think it's actually, this is a challenge in a way of these social media platforms, because what makes social media actually different and I think better than traditional media is those personal connections, or the strength of those bonds. And that actually starts to deteriorate as audiences scale up, and it actually reverts to something much more like broadcast. And yeah, I think we are right now in this kind of chemistry phase, a chemistry lab phase of this game, trying to figure out how the most basic things work and how we can basically trigger actions, or how we can use the platforms. But I think what's promising, really promising about the platform is the thing that I know that I've always wanted, which is to eliminate the middleman, and to eliminate the gatekeepers, and to eliminate the editors, and to be our own publishers and our own operators.
So I'd like to second that. So I got my PhD in '93, and I was really interested to write about how computers are changing culture. It was like nobody was writing about it in the US, but maybe 2 people. So I went to Europe. I found out there was already some scene. As an academic, you're supposed to publish in peer-reviewed journals. Like somebody's going to send you with reviews, and it takes 2 years. I'm like, why bother? So I made my website in '93, and I started putting everything I write on my website, and that's how I made my career. So you can download everything I wrote, for the last 20 years from my website. Even people would see it on my website and would say, can I put it in my anthology from Oxford University Press? I'm sure. So I still managed to get my academic promotions, but completely like playing the system, and I'm just surprised that, more people are not doing it today. But I also wanted to comment upon something, right, when you said about likes. So the social media platforms, which are going to evolve, will offer, right, this illusion that you get this feedback. Or my photo was liked by 800 million people, or that many people look at my photograph. But this is a very simplistic statistics. And one thing we can learn from industry, like last week we had Social Media Week in New York, which is basically marketing, advertising startups. These people, right, are constantly thinking about how to make these metrics better. So for example, you can say, okay, 1,000 people click on my photograph, but how much time did we spend? So even if people look at Google Analytics, right, which is a free product, you think about a diversity of metrics it offers, it gives you much more kind of nuanced view. So what I'm a little bit afraid, just to finish, I think your pseudo-Darwin quote was fantastic. And what I really feel is, maybe the smartest and most powerful intellectually, artistically, are people here, but the ones today which are evolving the fastest are industry. We're constantly inventing things, we're constantly going to adapt things, and in terms of understanding these platforms, I think we're often cultural issues are behind, which means we may not be able to survive.
So you mean we won't be able to survive trying to keep up with the platforms as they transform us before we even understand what they're doing to us? Is that what you think?
Well, we will not be able to survive in the sense of remaining like intellectually and just culturally viable, because we'll not be using these platforms into their full potential, only understanding them in the more sophisticated ways. Obviously it doesn't apply to you. So you should be like our kind of like a world community manager.
Yeah, but I think the thing that strikes me about your presentation post BaseTrack and looking for very specific Instagram feeds which are trying to feed to us ideas and ways of connecting and using this tool, this platform, not just creatively for themselves, but really to engage us in a different way towards something, almost like a triangulation, a repointing. And that's, I don't know what percentage do you think is moving in that direction, and to what, is that the most powerful use of this medium? Do you know what I'm saying? Obviously, we're sitting in a room with very large images, and I don't even know how long the photographer spent very involved in finding the locations and invested in it, and we can experience it in a completely different way. So I don't want to narrow the spectrum to this is the only thing that's important about working and authoring as a photographer. But what's the triangulation process for you? Where does it start? I saw you talked about BaseTrack. When Michael Christopher Brown goes to Congo, I don't know that he knows what he's going to find. So what would he point people to other than the same kind of exposure? And when you talk about major media, well, when we used it and when it was there for us, partnered well, it was millions and millions of people. So it was a way to very efficiently get to a very large audience, maybe only a percentage of an audience that's possible now with a very different filter.
I think it was actually a very inefficient way of reaching a large audience, and I think in a way, again, you'll see like how my brain has been totally warped by a decade in Iraq and Afghanistan, but like the parallel I always think of is, traditional conventional media, it was like carpet bombing. You just take the same message and you just lay fire everywhere you can. Social media is much more like surgical strikes. It is drone warfare, where you are watching that person for maybe a week before you tag them, and you know exactly who they are. You know their name, you know who they're related to, you know where they're going and where they live. And social media, that is what makes it different. That's, when Michael Brown goes to DRC, Michael can he can target specific communities with hashtags, geolocation, with even the difference between what we did on BaseTrack and my next experiences in Afghanistan on Instagram, because of hashtags and because of the change in the different demographics of mobile. I actually saw on Instagram the things happening that was ultimately that we were trying to get to with BaseTrack, which was Facebook based, and at that time Facebook is not using hashtags. So on Instagram we're seeing like when they dig into those likes and those followers and those conversations, you see a much different network of people, and they were younger and they were all over the world, and that's where it got to be interesting to me, where you'd see a thread where somebody in the U.S. military would be talking to a Pashtun girl from the north, from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and from many other places too. And those people didn't just randomly find that feed. None of these people, there's tens of thousands of people following, a particular feed. They're not my personal friends. So like, how did we connected with them very, very strategically and very tactically.
Yeah, I guess it's a little scary, that metaphor, because strategically and tactically, if if you're all have the same mission, but if you're on the other side of that mission, it's an interesting question. I don't know. I want to provoke the audience to think about it. I don't know if I'd feel better being carpet bombed or strategically targeted.
I think you'd be targeted by...
I'm sure there are many people who have lots of questions. So can we, Myron, we've got one there. Go ahead.
Hi. Sorry. I'm sorry, I'm not going to say your name because I'm going to butcher it, but this is for the maker of Selfie City. Lev.
Yeah, that was difficult.
It was like 7 people, and I put myself as a project coordinator. So
Yeah.
okay. So this way, if you ask something dangerous, and I say it's not my fault.
All right. And yeah, I have a question and a comment. My question's a little long-winded, so bear with me. I wrote it down because I didn't want to forget anything. So yeah, I'm interested in how when photos are inserted into social media, they become almost secondary images and primary points of data. And a lot of your research, and coming from a photo historian background and looking at formal elements of pictures or photographic history, kind of mines these images for, these different conclusions or readings of what we're looking at. But I found some really alarming parallels to your research and perhaps modes of surveillance and labor abuse that can happen within different forms of data mining. I'm imagining now, for example, when corporations, such as Facebook, for example, use social media data to come up with marketing schemes for, advertisers, or, even more threateningly when governmental forces mine data and images for ambiguous forms of security, which is really just surveillance. Another parallel that I actually found even more interesting was the use of labor within your work. So you kind of make a parallel between social media users who input their images into networks, and then these documentarian photographers in museums, where in fact, social media users, when they upload their images, they're giving up like their immaterial labor for this corporation it's been sold. And your documentary photographers are getting paid and recognized for their art that's in a museum. I think that's in fact the most interesting distinction. All this to say, I'm kind of curious where you see your work aligning with surveillance and potential labor abuse within social media, and if you think there's a way that you can conduct your research as a historian without perhaps replicating these modes. And this is a side note. I don't know where my friend Nathan is. My friend was here. He's waiting. Here he is. He made a point which I find very interesting, and I would kind of pose to you. If you're assuming that you're going to take your 2.3 million Instagram images and you're going to make some sort of experimental data analysis on it, I would think that looking at the age and images of women's bodies is a pretty myopic use of that data, and would urge you to maybe find a more critical point of entry. But, sorry, that was a lot.
Well, I will.
Go ahead.
I can't agree.
How do you think of surveillance and labor use in your work?
I can't agree more, so let me try to give you a more compact answer. And just to one point of correction, so when we did this 2.3 million, we didn't look at the bodies, we just looked at colors. Now we did analyze 3,200 photographs for Selfie City. I mean, we did look at both male and female. Of course, it was immediately pointed to us by my friend that this is a very kind of binary, gender labeling. I mean, how do you get Mechanical Turk workers, or even myself, right, to basically look at the picture and say, this is a transgender person. Right? So, several issues on labeling, but it's all very interesting. So, I mean, I like your question because I like to be in this position of, bad boy and kind of walking this, very dangerous line between research and surveillance. But I think it's very important that we do it, right? Because if we don't do it, then the company is going to take it all, right? So we'll be sitting, like, in our kind of Brooklyn sort of little apartments and just and be scared. The point is different, right? In the 20th century, there were this powerful social systems, and Stalin and Hitler, and mass media and photography and film, and you couldn't do much against TV. Well, in the 21st century, we can create our own system using software. So I guess Wikipedia would be a perfect example. Open source software would be another example. So I think it's important that we do research using kind of similar technologies which are used by military, by governments, by surveillance, to understand how we work, to expose, to understand our assumptions and to be able to use them differently. So ultimately, the goal of my lab is to help to democratize data mining and visual analysis, teach you how you can do your own research, so you can download 2.3 billion photographs and make whatever you want.
I think it's opened up many new opportunities. Instagram particularly. The fact that Instagram has become this sort of go-to platform and a necessity for every single brand on earth, it now means that every single one of them needs a visual communicator to operate that platform for them. And I see this a lot actually now, where I go and meet with organizations who absolutely want to get started on Instagram, but they don't know how, and they don't know how to make the photographs, they don't know how to communicate around the photographs. And potentially Instagram may, could become the greatest job creator in photography in modern history, potentially. But I think a lot comes down to my personal feeling that photographers and the photo industry in particular are still clinging to structures and methodologies that were developed in an analog period. And you see many, many organizations effectively disintegrating because they're still trying to do the same thing that they were doing 20 years ago, and it doesn't work anymore. So, yeah, I think it is definitely not an easy time, but it's certainly not one that's hopeless at all.
The same way that we have a voice, and we have kind of a craft and all that kind of stuff. Other people have voices as well, and there's in some ways starting to misuse or can abuse these social networks. So like the most recent example is pictures that Syrian rebels were tweeting that were not even in Syria, or even in Venezuela, people were tweeting pictures that were produced in Syria. So how does that kind of shake out? I mean, I think that eventually people, the same way that they learn to trust particular newspapers, will start to trust particular content producers. But I guess I'm curious to see like how you guys would see that shaking out culturally. Because right now there's no like real way of knowing who to trust or not to trust, especially for the layman, right? I mean, we're in the media industry, so we know who to trust, and we often know people who are producing content.
Right, but I think like the first question is, those scenarios you mentioned where pictures falsely being labeled or being published dishonestly or inaccurately. Do any of us think that that wasn't happening in an analog world? We just didn't find out about it as easily. And that's the other side of that coin and that knife, is that social media also allows you to backtrack and check these sources in a much more fine-tuned way than conventional media did. And it's actually, with social media, you actually can see exactly who people are connected to. So, I mean, personally, when I see anything on, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, the first thing I do is I look to see what's the chain here? Where are these people? Who is this person connected to? What does their social graph look like? Do I trust this person at all? And I think you're also pointing to something that I think I like about this new era, and I think I mentioned that a little bit, the idea that individuals have more traction than institutions, because there's no institution that hasn't made mistakes, and so I may not trust a particular newspaper at all, but I do trust particular individuals who work for it or publish through it. So, I think there's two sides to that, and I think in many ways social media is a better framework for accuracy than the conventional media.
I would just add that you guys know it, but I will remind you anyway that in China, right, where have these big buildings with like 30 or 300,000 people, like bureaucrats. So you come to work and when you're writing these blog posts, I'm like 19-year-old girl. I have Gucci. I believe in the Communist Party, right? So a big percentage of the social media in China is is done by society, but it doesn't prevent people in China to use social media very effectively. There's like 680 million users, 500 using it for mobile. So I agree, but I think things were much worse in the 18th and 19th and 20th century. I mean, yes, we have certain fabricated voices, we have government spies or bots, but we have so many normal people. I mean, it's probably possible with some work to develop some algorithm which will help us to actually identify, maybe using social graph, who is real, who is not. But you probably develop intuition after a while.
Aperture.